Do you want to make a high score list for your JavaScript game? So players from all over the world have a chance to compete for a spot on your game's high score list. Welcome back to Coding Commanders. I'm Commander Candy, and today I am going to show you how to make a JavaScript game high score list. We will use JavaScript, the Fetch API, JSON for our data, and PHP. Because this video is mainly about the JavaScript, we're not going to go over the other files too much. I will go over the PHP file after the JavaScript in case that's a server-side language you're using, but I'm just going to copy and paste the other files from my website, codingcommanders.com. The direct link to the corresponding lesson is in the video description. We are going to start with scores.json, where we will store our high score list data. It is structured as an array of objects where the key name points to the player's name data and the key score points to the high score. Next, style.css, where we will style our game. Next is index.html. Most I went over in my previous tutorials. There is just a couple new HTML elements related to the code we're about to write that I'll briefly point out. The page body isn't new, but we have added an attribute on load equal to get scores of list scores. These are two JavaScript functions that we're about to write. And of course, we have our high score list. Above it is a container to display any errors that JavaScript might return to us. And below it is a hidden input field to store the lowest high score. At the very bottom, we include the JavaScript file we are about to write, main.js. We are in main.js. The game logic and game scoring was already done in my two previous tutorials. Today we are gonna start with using the Fetch API to read our scores.json file. First, we're going to declare a constant called errors that's going to be equal to that error display div in the HTML file. Now we're creating our function getScores that has one parameter, a callback. And this is going to be the function responsible for fetching our scores from scores.json. We're going to let file equal scores.json. The fetch function has one mandatory parameter, the file location, but we're also going to do a little configuration. We do not want it to cache scores.json. If there have been updates, we are going to want those updates to be displayed each time we call this function. Then when we get a response back, if it's okay, it's going to be equal to 200. If it's not equal to 200, we are going to display that response status in our errors div. But if it is okay, because we want to parse the body text as a JSON, we are adding the JSON method to the response. Then we take that HTTP data and parse it into a JSON string that gets stored in the variable called scores. Then we console log scores so we can view it when we test our code, make sure it's all good. And we also pass scores into our callback function. Now we just have to catch any errors and display them in our errors div, and we are finished with getScores. I made a silly mistake. I forgot to capitalize the E in errors to match our constant equal to the errors div. Now that we've fetched our JSON data, we are ready to display it in our high score list. First, we're going to declare another constant called list with a capital L, and we are going to set it equal to that ordered list element with the ID of high scores. List scores is going to be the callback function we pass into getScores, and it is a function of scores. Firstly, we're going to parse scores into a JavaScript object, and because I'm so creative with my variable names, I called it object. We are going to let the lowest score equal the object indexed at 9 score, which would be the lowest score on the list. Remember our hidden input field with the ID of low score? We're going to set its value equal to the lowest score, and we're just going to store that and save it for later. Now we have a for loop. We're gonna let I equal to 0. I is less than object.length, I++. So it's gonna loop through all of the objects in our object array with an index between 0 and the number that's 1 less than the number of items in our object array. Because the number 1 high score is indexed at 0, the number 10 high score would be indexed at 9, which is 1 less than the total number of objects in the array, which is 10. Make sense? We're gonna let li equal a list item we're creating. We're gonna let text equal a text node we're creating, which is going to state the name of the current player object we're accessing, plus space dot 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 space, plus the score of that player. Then we are going to append that list item we created with the text. We're going to stick that text in there, and we are going to take the li element we created and add it to the list. And I'm making the text font a little bit bigger for the top 3 scores. The top score is the biggest, then the second score, then the third, and all the remaining scores are going to have the same size. In order to have a high score list publicly accessible for multiple players online to compete to get on that high score list, you're gonna have to have interaction with a server. If you don't have server access, no need to fear. I have a super easy to follow tutorial on creating a LambStack virtual server. The server I'm testing my code on today is the exact server I made in that video.
Here is how our code looks so far. See the high score list?
And remember where we console log data. If we F12, we can take a look at what that data looks like. There is our JSON stringified response of the high score data. Next, we are going to make the end game button work by using the fetch command to post its data back to PHP, which we will then use to rewrite the scores.json file. But first, we're going to write a function that I called reset form that we're going to call inside of our submit button function after PHP has a chance to update the file, just in case the player made it on the high score list. We're going to start off by deleting all of the li elements inside of our high score ordered list. Then we are going to call get scores with list scores passed into it so we could recreate the high score list with the new data. And we're going to set the score variable equal to 0, and we're also going to put the value inside of our score input field. We're going to have that equal to 0 as well. Now we're ready to write the code that submits our game form. First, we're going to listen in on our form with the ID myForm. For the user to click the submit button. When they do click the submit button, we're going to prevent the page from reloading. Remember that low score value that I said that we were going to save for later? Well, the time has come. We're going to take that value in that hidden input field of the lowest high score, and we're going to store it in a variable called 10th score. Then we are going to do a little comparison. We're going to use an if statement. If the player's score is greater than the low score, we're going to take an image element that we made in my first video in this series, make a JavaScript dice game. It has an ID of message, and we're going to put a high score GIF in there. Otherwise, if they did not beat the lowest high score, they didn't make it on the high score list, we're going to set that image element back to the starting good luck image. And I'm going to go ahead and change that second if statement to an else statement. If their score is greater than the lowest high score, they made it on the list. In any other case, they did not. Now we're going to make a new formData object to store it in a variable called formData. Using myForm's data, which is the player's name and his score. A formData object is used to send data in a key value format. Finally, we use the fetch API to send our formData back to our PHP script, which is called dice.php. We're going to use the post method to send it. If we successfully receive an HTTP response back from dice.php, we convert it into plain text. Then we print the response to the console. As you create your server-side file, you're probably going to change what you're sending back to be converted to text and printed in the console based on what you're trying to test at the moment. We're also going to go ahead and execute our reset form function. We will display the error in our element with the ID errors. Our JavaScript is complete. Now all we have to do is write our server code.
Now that we are in dice.php, we will take the form data from my form that we sent back to PHP via the post method and stick it in PHP variables. The player's name is going to go inside a variable called $player_name.
And we're going to do just a little sanitation to make sure that the user did not include any tags in their username. And then we're going to take the player's score and stick it in a variable, $player_score, and we're going to make sure that variable is an integer. Then we're going to take both the player's name and the player's score and stick it in an associated array called player array, where the key name points to player name and the key score points to player score. Then we're going to read the contents of scores.json, stick it in a variable called highscore.json, and then we are going to decode highscore.json into an associative PHP array and store it in highscore_array. Next, we are declaring a very special variable called $key and initializing it at 0. And we're also declaring high scores, which is right now an empty array. But if the player made it on the high score list, high scores will hold the new high score data. $key is going to point to the player's new high score within that high scores array. High scores 9 score is storing the lowest score currently on the high score list. If the player's score is higher than the last score on the high score list, then they achieved a spot on the high score list. And we're going to go through a for each loop, looping through the high score array as K points to value. If you get confused what any of this stuff means, you can just do a var dump. Let's look at $K first. Here we can see the keys. Next, we're going to take a look at $value to see what the keys are pointing to. And we can see the individual associative arrays that match those JSON objects.
We declare scores and set it equal to the current iteration score property. If score is greater than or equal to the player's score, the player did not beat this high score. So the element will have the same index in high scores as it has in high score array.
However, if score is less than the player's score, the player has beat the score. The first time this happens, we want to set key equal to K, this iteration's index. We have found the player's index in high scores.
Now all we have left to do is loop through the remaining high score array elements, excluding the 10th score that's been kicked off the list, and we will add them to our new array, high scores, at an index of 1 more than their index was in high score array. And now we break out the loop. We do not have to loop through the elements anymore.
Now we encode high scores into a JSON string and write it to scores.json. The player is happy. He made the high score list. Else, the player is sad. He did not make it on the list.
Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to subscribe for more super awesome LAMP stack and computer programming tutorials. If you have any questions, please comment below and let me know. Thank you again for watching my video, and until next time, happy coding!